Sometimes life tests us in ways we never imagined, and the choices we make in those moments can define who we are forever. Before I take you into this powerful and emotional story, let me ask you, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below because our Outstanding Stories family is growing across the world, and I'd love to know how far this story reaches. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe and rate this story at the end, because what you're about to hear is not just a tale of struggle, but one of resilience, dignity, and an unexpected twist that will leave you speechless. It all begins with a woman named Clara, a single mother who was known in her small town for her quiet strength, her unshakable love for her son, and her willingness to do any honest work to keep her family afloat. Clara had been raising her little boy, Samuel, entirely on her own ever since her husband left without a trace years earlier, leaving her with nothing but unpaid bills and a child to feed. Life was not kind, and every day seemed like a battle to stretch every coin she earned. She worked long hours cleaning offices, waiting tables at night, and even sewing clothes for neighbors just to make enough to put food on the table. Yet despite the hardships, she never complained. To Samuel, she was not just a mother, she was a hero. He admired her more than anyone in the world, though he never fully understood the weight she carried on her shoulders each day. But there came a time when all of Clara's efforts weren't enough. Samuel fell ill, and the medical expenses began piling up in numbers that terrified her. She sold her wedding ring. She sold her old furniture and even pawned away her grandmother's necklace just to pay for the hospital bills. Still, the debt collectors kept knocking at her door, and the doctors kept demanding more. One night, as she sat by Samuel's bedside in the dimly lit hospital room, staring at his pale face, she realized she was running out of time and options. That was when a stranger entered her life, a millionaire whose reputation was known throughout the city, a man named Richard Hale. Richard was wealthy beyond imagination, a man who lived in mansions, drove the finest cars, and surrounded himself with luxury. But behind his wealth, he was known as eccentric, unpredictable, and even a little cruel at times. People whispered about him in hushed tones, about how he played games with people's lives just for his own amusement. Clara had no reason to cross paths with him, but fate had its own strange way of weaving people together. One evening, she was called into the hospital administrator's office, where she found Richard sitting casually in an expensive suit, sipping wine as if he owned the place. He had heard about Clara's struggles through someone in the hospital staff, and though she didn't understand why, he was interested in her situation. What he proposed shocked her to the core. Richard told her he was willing to cover Samuel's medical bills, every last cent, and even provide money for his education in the future. But in return, Clara had to agree to something unthinkable. She had to bathe him every evening for an entire month. Clara sat frozen, unable to believe what she was hearing. She thought it was a cruel joke, some kind of twisted test to humiliate her. The humiliation burned inside her chest like fire. But when she looked at Samuel's face, weak and fighting for life, she knew she had no choice. Pride could not save her son. Only sacrifice could. And so, with a trembling voice, she whispered, "I'll do it." Richard smiled faintly, as though he had been waiting for that answer all along. And just like that, Clara's life was about to change in ways she never saw coming. The first evening Clara arrived at Richard Hale's mansion, she felt as though she had stepped into a world that did not belong to her. The massive iron gates creaked open, revealing a driveway longer than any street in her small neighborhood. Marble statues lined the path, fountains danced under carefully placed lights, and the house itself, if it could be called a house, looked more like a palace. For a moment, she almost turned around, her instincts screaming that she didn't belong here, that she was stepping into a trap that could swallow her whole. But then, Samuel's fragile smile flashed in her mind, the way he held her hand in the hospital bed, whispering, "Don't worry, Mama. You're the strongest person I know." That memory gave her courage. She forced her trembling legs to carry her up the grand staircase and through the giant carved doors, where Richard's butler, a stern man in his 60s named Collins, greeted her with a bow that somehow made her feel smaller. not respected. Collins led her silently through endless halls adorned with golden frames and sparkling chandeliers until they reached a dimly lit chamber that smelled faintly of expensive cologne and cedarwood. Richard was already there, lounging in a silk robe by an oversized bath that looked like it belonged in a palace spa. He looked up at her slowly, studying her face with an expression that made her feel as if he could see right through her. "You came," he said calmly, as though he had doubted she would. Clara nodded, her throat dry, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "Good," Richard said. "I like a woman who keeps her word." And with that, he gestured toward the bath. Her stomach churned, humiliation boiling inside her, but she remembered Samuel's pale face again. She set her jaw and stepped forward. The task was simple in action, but crushing in dignity. She filled the bath with warm water, her fingers shaking as she adjusted the taps, then gently placed fragrant oils into the water as instructed. Richard watched her silently, sipping a glass of wine, his eyes following her every move. Finally, when the bath was ready, he disrobed with no shame, slipping into the water with the relaxed elegance of a man too wealthy to care about the world's judgment. Clara averted her eyes, focusing only on the task. She dipped the sponge into the water and began washing his arms, his back, his shoulders, every motion slow and mechanical, her face stiff with forced calmness. Richard did not speak at first. He simply studied her. Then, as minutes passed, he broke the silence with questions that caught her off guard. "Tell me about your son," he asked casually, as if they were at a dinner table. Clara froze, then hesitantly answered. She told him about Samuel, about how smart he was, how he dreamed of becoming a pilot one day, how he loved drawing airplanes and reading books about the sky. Richard listened quietly, his face unreadable. "And what about you?" he asked next. "What do you dream of?" The question pierced her like a knife. Dreams? She hadn't thought about her own dreams in years. Her dream was survival, keeping food on the table, making sure Samuel had a future. She wanted to snap at him, to say, "How dare you ask me that while you sit here in your wealth, making me do this humiliating thing?" But instead, she whispered, "My only dream is to see my son live a life better than mine." For the first time, Richard's expression shifted. Something flickered in his eyes, something softer than the arrogance she had expected. He didn't comment. Instead, he leaned back, closing his eyes as if lost in thought. When the bath ended, Clara quickly gathered her things, desperate to leave. But before she could go, Richard handed her an envelope. "For tonight," he said. She opened it outside the gates, and her breath caught. Inside was more money than she would normally make in 6 months. She clutched it to her chest, tears stinging her eyes. That night, she paid off part of Samuel's bills, and for the first time in weeks, she slept with a tiny shred of relief. Yet she knew this was just the beginning. Every evening for the next month, she would return to that mansion, carrying the weight of humiliation on her shoulders. But what Clara didn't realize was that beneath Richard's cold exterior, something was shifting too. And soon, the unexpected would begin to unfold in ways that neither of them could have ever imagined. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Clara had never imagined for herself. Each evening, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky bled into hues of violet and gold, she would leave her modest apartment after kissing Samuel goodnight, telling him she had to work late. She couldn't bring herself to explain the truth, not to those innocent eyes that trusted her unconditionally. The cab ride to Richard Hale's estate always felt like traveling into another universe, one where marble statues, polished floors, and velvet curtains whispered stories of wealth she would never taste. Every night, Collins, the butler, would lead her down those intimidating halls until she reached the bathing chamber. At first, each evening felt like torture, a rehearsal of her humiliation. She would prepare the bath, add oils, light candles at his instruction, and then wash him silently, her hands careful, her eyes always looking downward to avoid his gaze. Yet, as the nights passed, something began to shift in the silence between them. Richard, who had once spoken with the clipped tones of a man used to being obeyed, began to ask her questions, not about trivial things, but about life. He wanted to know about her childhood, about the small town she had left behind, about the struggles she faced as a single mother. Clara, though hesitant at first, found herself answering. Maybe it was the way his eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that suggested he truly listened. Or maybe it was because she had bottled up her story for so long with no one to hear it. Whatever the reason, the words spilled out slowly, like water breaking through cracks in a dam. One evening, after she spoke of working 3 jobs just to pay rent, Richard leaned back in the bath and whispered, almost to himself, "You're stronger than most people I know." The compliment startled her. She had expected arrogance, mockery even, but not admiration. She didn't know how to respond, so she busied herself with the sponge, trying to ignore the warmth creeping in her chest. Over time, Clara began to notice things about Richard she had overlooked in her initial disgust. Beneath the layers of silk robes and casual luxury, he carried a heaviness, a silence that no amount of money could drown. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes as she washed his shoulders, she saw lines of pain carved deep into his face, as though haunted by ghosts he refused to speak of. Once, she caught him staring at the ceiling with a look so hollow that it made her pause mid-motion. But when she asked if he was all right, his mask slipped back into place, and he dismissed her concern with a half-smile. Despite his wealth, Richard seemed lonelier than anyone Clara had ever known. One particular evening changed everything. The storm outside had been fierce, rain lashing against the mansion's windows, thunder growling like an angry beast. Clara arrived soaked, her thin coat clinging to her body, her hair dripping wet. She expected Richard to mock her appearance, but instead, he rose from his chair before the bath and wordlessly handed her a towel. She froze, surprised by the gesture, before reluctantly taking it. "You'll catch a fever like that," he said, his tone softer than usual. The words lingered in her mind long after the bath ended. That night, after she had finished her task, Richard didn't let her leave immediately. He invited her to sit in the armchair by the fire. For the first time, they talked outside the confines of the ritual. He poured her a glass of wine, though she refused politely, and asked about her dreams again. When she repeated that her only dream was Samuel's future, he shook his head and said, "That's not a dream. That's duty. What about you, Clara?" The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. She didn't answer because she didn't know. Somewhere along the line, her dreams had died quietly, replaced by responsibilities. She stared into the fire, trying to remember who she used to be, but all she could see was Samuel's smile. In those long conversations, cracks began to appear in Richard's carefully constructed mask. He revealed little pieces of his own past, not in full, but in fragments. Mentions of a estranged family, of a marriage that had ended in betrayal, of a son he once had but no longer spoke of. Clara listened, her hands folded in her lap, her heart torn between pity and anger. This man who sat on a mountain of wealth was just as broken as she was, though in a different way. It was then she realized that the unexpected was already happening. She had come here believing she was selling her dignity for money, but now she was learning that beneath the surface of humiliation lay something neither of them had anticipated, a fragile connection. Weeks rolled into months, and Clara could hardly believe how entangled her life had become with Richard Hale's world. What began as a degrading agreement had transformed into something much more complex, something she hadn't signed up for. Samuel, innocent as he was, had begun to notice her late-night absences. One evening as she tucked him into bed, he asked, "Mama, why do you come home so tired every night? Did the store make you stay late again?" His small hand held hers tightly, and she forced a smile, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Yes, baby, just work," she whispered, her chest tightening with guilt. How could she tell her son that she spent her nights bathing a man who owned more wealth than they could imagine? She kissed his forehead and turned off the light, but Samuel's question lingered in her heart long after she left for the mansion. Richard, on the other hand, seemed to sense the weight she carried. His demeanor had changed. Where once he barked commands, now he spoke softly, sometimes even thanking her when a bath ended. One night, he surprised her by asking her opinion on a business matter. "Clara," he said, leaning against the edge of the tub, "if you were running a company and someone betrayed you, would you fire them immediately or give them another chance?" The question stunned her. Why was he asking a woman like her about corporate decisions? But when she cautiously offered her perspective, sometimes people make mistakes because they're desperate, not because they're malicious. He actually nodded as if she had said something profound. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to her. That was the first time she realized he might be using these conversations as more than idle talk. He was testing her mind, her values, and her strength that IT wasn't just conversations that changed. Subtle gestures made her pause too. Once, when she slipped on the wet tiles and almost fell, Richard caught her wrist before she hit the floor. The grip was firm, protective, almost instinctive. Their eyes met for a moment that felt far longer than it was, and Clara's heart stuttered. She pulled her hand away quickly, murmuring a thank you, but she couldn't shake the way he had looked at her, like she wasn't just a maid performing a task, but someone whose presence mattered. Another night, when she arrived looking pale from skipping dinner to save money, Richard noticed instantly. Without a word, he ordered Collins to bring food for both of them. She resisted at first, humiliated at the thought of eating in front of him, but hunger won, and soon she found herself sharing a quiet meal at the table beside the fire. For the first time, she saw him smile. Not the practiced, polished smile of a millionaire, but a fleeting, genuine curve of the lips that made him look almost boyish. Meanwhile, Samuel grew more suspicious. Children had a way of noticing what adults try to hide. He started waiting up for her, fighting sleep, determined to ask more questions. One night, when she returned home later than usual, she found him sitting on the couch with his small arms folded, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but filled with curiosity. "Mama," he asked softly, "do you really work at the store? Because sometimes I think you don't." The innocence in his voice tore through her heart. She knelt in front of him, hugged him tightly, and whispered, "I work because of you, Samuel. Everything I do is for you." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. The guilt gnawed at her more fiercely than ever. Back at the mansion, the storms of change continued. Richard revealed more fragments of his broken life. About the betrayal by his brother, about the inheritance battles that left him hardened, about the woman he once loved who had abandoned him when he needed her most. Clara listened in silence, sometimes wanting to comfort him, other times resenting him for his ability to wallow in loneliness while sitting in a palace she could never dream of. Yet, despite her resentment, she couldn't deny that something within her shifted each time he let his vulnerability show. What surprised her most was how he began to trust her, not just with his stories, but with his silence. There were nights when they barely spoke, yet the quiet between them felt less like tension and more like understanding. The unexpected continued to unfold. Clara realized she no longer saw Richard solely as the arrogant millionaire who had forced her into this arrangement. He was still flawed, still infuriating at times, but he was also human, lonely, bruised, and in some strange way, searching for redemption. And though she fought it with every ounce of strength she had, Clara couldn't deny that her own heart had started to betray her. She caught herself thinking about him when she was home, noticing the absence of his voice on the nights she didn't go, and worst of all, feeling a sense of comfort in his presence that she had no right to feel. She had entered this world to survive for her son, but now, the survival had turned into something much more dangerous, an emotional entanglement neither of them had planned for. The night of truth arrived without warning, creeping into Clara's life like a storm she couldn't outrun. Samuel had fallen ill, his little body weakened by fever, his small chest heaving with every breath. Clara sat by his side, wringing a cold cloth and whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. Her heart ached at the sight of him, her only anchor in life, suffering as she scrambled for ways to afford the medicine the doctor insisted he needed. With trembling hands, she counted the crumpled bills in her purse and realized, with a sinking heart, that she didn't have enough. Desperation clawed at her throat. It was in this moment of despair that her phone buzzed with a message. "You're late." "Where are you?" It was from Richard. For a long moment, she stared at the screen, torn between her duty to her son and the obligation she had shackled herself with. Finally, she typed back, "My son is sick. I can't come tonight." She expected anger, perhaps even threats, but what she received stunned her. A few minutes later, a black car pulled up outside her shabby apartment, and Richard himself stepped out. He had never seen her home before. Standing in her doorway, his eyes swept across the peeling wallpaper, the second-hand furniture, the flickering bulb in the ceiling, and finally, Samuel's small frame burning with fever on the couch. Something in Richard's gaze shifted, and for once, Clara didn't see the powerful millionaire. She saw a man stripped of his armor, confronted with a reality he had never touched. Without asking permission, he called his private physician, who arrived within the hour with medicine and equipment Clara could never have afforded. Samuel was treated, his fever gradually breaking as he drifted into a peaceful sleep. Clara, overwhelmed, sat on the edge of the couch with tears streaming down her cheeks. Why would you do this?" she whispered. Richard looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because I've been blind, Clara. I thought I was buying your obedience, but all along, you were giving me something money can't buy. Honesty, care, humanity." The unexpected that Clara had feared finally revealed itself. But it wasn't humiliation. It was vulnerability. Richard stayed that night, not as a man being served, but as a man desperate to be seen. He confessed things he had never told anyone. How his fortune had left him surrounded by people who wanted pieces of him but never truly cared. How he had driven away the few who did care by hiding behind his arrogance. And how he had never felt more alive than in the quiet moments he shared with her. Clara listened, torn between disbelief and an aching recognition. Here was a man she had despised, who had forced her into degrading service, now confessing that she had given him something he never knew he lacked. Meaning, as dawn broke, Samuel awoke to find Richard still there, seated in the armchair by his bed. To Clara's surprise, Samuel didn't fear him. Instead, the boy blinked sleepily and whispered, "Are you my mom's friend?" Richard's lips curved into the gentlest smile Clara had ever seen. "Yes," he said softly. "I'd like to be." That single exchange shattered the last of Clara's walls. She realized the unimaginable had happened. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about connection, about a broken man finding healing in a woman who had nothing to offer but her strength, and a mother discovering that even in the strangest of circumstances, love could bloom where least expected. From that day forward, the arrangement that had begun with shame was never the same. Richard stopped treating her like an obligation and began treating her like a partner. He insisted on supporting Samuel's education, not as charity, but as an investment in a future he believed in. Clara fought against accepting, her pride screaming, but Richard's persistence and sincerity finally broke through. He no longer summoned her to bathe him. Instead, he asked her to sit with him, to talk, to share meals. Their bond deepened until it became undeniable. The woman who had once felt like a maid in his palace became the only person whose opinion mattered to him, the only one who could quiet his storms. The unexpected ending wasn't scandal or shame. It was redemption. Clara learned that survival sometimes leads us into places we never imagined. But within those places, life plants seeds of transformation. Samuel gained not only a protector, but also someone who valued him as much as his mother did. And Richard Hale, the millionaire who once believed wealth could buy anything, discovered the one thing it never could: love born from struggle, respect, and truth. For Clara, what began as a desperate act to support her son ended as a story of empowerment and healing. The woman who had bowed her head in humiliation walked forward with it held high, knowing that sometimes the most unexpected turns in life are the very ones that lead us home.